Sure, we're going to look at early East Asia, Japan, China, Mongolia, and Korea until 1600. Basically, want to understand, the character of East Asia, how it's related to its politics, its economics, social and cultural elements. And we're also going to learn elements of East Asian culture, including language, religion, beliefs, institutions, and technologies. So we're going to start with China. When it comes to East Asia, keep in mind that this is a very diverse region, especially countries that are as large as modern China is. When we take a look at China today, we may have this temptation to look at it as one homogeneous people, with one culture, one language. And in fact, China always has been incredibly diverse. A lot of different ethnic groups, a lot of different languages there. In fact, if you went back to ancient China, oftentimes you had different kingdoms constantly warring against each other. You could live in one village, walk down a road to a neighboring village and not even understand the people living there because you spoke such completely different languages. So this is a very diverse part of the world. So when we take a look at China, China is probably one of the most ancient cultures that we have on the planet. There were things, technologies that China was using as early in their history that we don't actually encounter in European history until pretty much the modern era. So if we take a look at the iron plow, China was using it as early as around 500 years before the Common Era. Europe, on the other hand, you're talking about late medieval ages or the Renaissance until the iron plow really starts to appear in European fields. And in fact, China itself, when we take a look at it, was one of the very first places in the world to actually have an imperial bureaucracy, so an organized system of government. So very ancient culture, very organized culture. So when we look at China, what we need to understand is that much of classical Chinese society was very ordered. We went through a succession of different dynasties, and so each dynasty would, when they come to power, they expand, they try to unite all of, the lands that, exist within modern China. And according to ancient Chinese thought, the emperor who ruled over the dynasty ruled based on what was called the mandate of heaven. This was the idea that the gods had basically given him the right to rule over the people. So they were expected to obey his command. And in exchange, what the emperor did was guarantee social order and guarantee peace and prosperity. So when we study the physical environment of Japan, one of the things that humans have done recently to try to control the environment was to construct the Three Gorges Dam on the Changjiang River. And one of the reasons why they constructed the dam was to control the flooding that the river would constantly do that could cost a lot in terms of lives and property and crops. So in the case of a dynasty, you could have an emperor, and one of the things that they were supposed to do was through a series of irrigation and other projects was to kind of limit the damage that the river's flooding did. And so we actually have historical records where, there would be a really bad flood one year. It would cause a lot of death and destruction. And the end result was, revolution against the dynasty because it was viewed that the emperor had failed to uphold his side of the mandate of heaven, that he had basically lost it. So this was the way that they organized government and society, was around these dynasties. And they had a massive, what we call bureaucracy, to help government run efficiently. So in the United States of America today, we have a bureaucracy as well at the state and the federal level of state and federal employees that, basically make everything run. And we expect them to be educated, to go to university, to be skilled in their jobs. This is a very new development in American history. We didn't really have this organized civil service until the late 1800s. In European history, we don't really see this develop until the time of Louis XIV of France. You're talking about the 1600s. China, they had it, about the time when the Egyptian pharaohs, were sitting on their thrones. And they also had, again, this kind of religious social philosophy known as Confucianism to support it even further. So remember, Confucius, he taught things like, the golden rule, treat others as you would have them treat you. But he was also really big on, social order. Parents should obey their children. People should obey the law. And, Confucianism at the heart of it was this idea that, you should have this highly educated, cultivated group that would help society function. So in this case, the bureaucrats. So when we look at these different dynasties, we can go through each one, and there are a lot of dynasties. So on the right-hand side, I've presented a table here of just some of the big dynasties in Chinese history. Keep in mind this isn't all of them, but it starts with the Shah dynasty. It's the very first one. This back 2,000 years before the Common Era. We're still using stone tools. They were replaced by the Shang dynasty, and so it was early 1766. This is when the Chinese writing system that they still use today begins to appear. And then 1027, this is when the new dynasty, the Zhao dynasty, emerges. And I've given you two spellings on some of these dynasties as well. So Zhao or Chao dynasty. So here, this is when that massive system of irrigation, ironworking, horses, Confucianism, Taoism, the writing system, all of this is appearing, culture is really flourishing. And then by 221, they've been replaced by the Qin dynasty, and this is the dynasty that gives China, modern China, its name. So the Great Wall was being constructed at this time, and later on, during the Ming Dynasty, this is when they're going to come and finish sections of the wall. So it wasn't complete in its modern form, but the Qin, they started, they're ones that built massive sections of it to protect against, Mongolian raiders. And later dynasties, they'll come and add to it and give it the current design that it has. But just to show, how extensive this dynasty was, they were able to build a Great Wall. One of their emperors was buried with a terracotta army. These statues, life-size statues of soldiers that were just, literally built him an army in his of these statues in his grave. So it took a lot of manpower, a lot of artists, a lot of wealth to produce, these types of works. So after this, you get the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE. So the Qin didn't last long, and the Han, they're going to come in right behind them. They're going to go from 206 years before the Common Era to 220 CE. So, you're talking about pretty much the same reign almost as the Roman Empire. This is where they expand pretty much to their present borders, and this is really where modern Chinese cultures truly developed. This is where you can say this is Chinese culture. And so, today people oftentimes refer to themselves as the people of the Han. So following them, you got the Tang Dynasty. Not immediately following, about 400 years later, you get into the Tang Dynasty, and this is what we call the Golden Age of China. So the Silk Road is in full swing. A lot of wealth going in. They build this huge complex capital at the city of Shan. Buddhism appears. Their culture spreading to Korea and to China. And then after that, you go into the Song Dynasty, long-lived, but they're the ones that are going to fall to the Mongolians. And so this is where you get into the Yuan Dynasty. This is the Mongol Dynasty. And then after the Mongols are overthrown, you'll go back to a truly Chinese dynasty under the Ming. And they're going to reign for a while, but this is really kind of the beginning of the descent for China in terms of power. Up until this point, they had some of the largest militaries in the world, incredibly wealthy. The Ming still very respectable in terms of an empire. But they leave their dynasty in a somewhat weakened condition, and the people that inherit it are the Qing or the Manchu, as they're more commonly known. And this is the last dynasty. So this is really where Chinese power begins to fade. And by the 1700s, Europeans begin to appear along the coastline at port cities. They start carving out little pieces of China until finally by the late 1800s, it's Europeans and Americans and other nations going in and basically just claiming chunks of it. And, this is the weakest point that China's at until after the Communist Revolution. Now, another major country in modern East Asia is Mongolia, and the Mongols had their kind of their heyday, if you will, their big time during the what we would call the Middle Ages in Europe. So they were a people that practiced what we call nomadic pastoralism. So they livestock, it was their main source of wealth and their main source of their livelihood, and they would basically move their herds from pasture to pasture. And of course, doing this, they learned how to be very capable cavalrymen. So each Mongolian was expected to be able to go to war on horseback. And they were very gifted in this form of fighting. So, in the case of the Great Wall of China, why was it built? Well, it was built to keep the Mongols out of northern China. And so basically, when you went to Mongolia, you would have a bunch of different tribes, and then each tribe had its own chieftain. It was very, what we would call democratic. But then in 1155, a guy is born by the name of Genghis Khan, which sometimes is pronounced as Genghis Khan. And he's the guy that kind of comes together and unites all of the different tribes into one big, massive army. And then they begin just conquering throughout, as far west as Moscow and Kiev in Eastern Europe. They're going to conquer all the way into the Middle East. One of his grandchildren are going to eventually capture Baghdad. And then Genghis Khan himself, he's the one that expands past the Great Wall into northern China and begins the conquest of China. And he will die. He dies 1227. The great Khan of this massive empire, the Great Khanate. But what happens is he basically is going to pass it on mostly to his grandchildren. And they go and they split it up into a bunch of different what we call Khanates. So you have the Ilkhan Khanate, the Khanate of the Chagatai, the Golden Horde. And then the Great Khan was Kublai Khan, one of his grandsons, who ruled from his new capital of Peking. And he's the one that really kind of forms the Yuan dynasty. And it's Kublai Khan that Marco Polo encounters on his family's trip to China and writes extensively about. And from Mongolia, what will happen is they'll try to extend their power even further into Korea. The Koreans will generally resist them, though. They tried to invade Japan twice, but their ships were hit by typhoons 2 times. And these typhoons, because they destroyed the Mongol ships, they were called the kamikaze, or the divine winds, by the Japanese. Now, the next kingdom is that of Korea. The next area is modern Korea. And modern Korea began really as 3 separate kingdoms. 3 major. We call them the 3 kingdoms: Goguryeo, Paekche, and Silla. As you can see, that one from this map, there was another one, but these were the 3 main ones, and they pretty much shared power. Although the 3 kingdoms would go to war with each other off and on. And one thing about Korea is they inherited a lot of Chinese. They were a separate ethnic group, but they inherited or borrowed a lot from Chinese culture, including their writing. They adopted Confucianism and Buddhism from China as well. And what will happen eventually is that these 3 kingdoms, through a series of war, eventually will consolidate under the control of Silla. So basically, they'll defeat the other 2 kingdoms by 668 of the Common Era. And then later on, Silla will fall to a new kingdom known as Goryeo. And it's from the name of the Koryo Kingdom that we get the modern name of Korea, so Koryo Korea. And so the Koreans, they pretty much, maintain their independence all the way up until the Manchu dynasty invades in, around the 1300s. But there will be a brief period, or sorry, the Yuan dynasty, they're the first ones that are going to conquer Korea. They turn them into a vassal state. The Koreans have they maintain some of their independence. And they'll regain their independence in 1400, but then it'll be the Manchu dynasty that'll first deliver a major blow to Korean independence, followed by the Japanese Empire starting in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that'll colonize Korea. And they'll stay pretty much a colonial power up until after World War II. Now, the final kingdom is Japan. And Japan consists of 4 major islands. You have Hokkaido to the north. Honshu is the main island. Shikoku is a small island off the southeastern coast of Honshu, and then you have Kyushu to the south. And in popular Japanese history, they hold that they are a completely separate ethnic group, but scientific evidence has shown and linked them through archaeology and other means to the Korean people. So we believe that they were an offshoot of the Koreans who colonized the island, starting with the southernmost island of Kyushu. And there were actually people living there already. You had the Jomon in the south, and you had the Ainu in the north. And what will happen is the Japanese will replace them. Although you still have some of these indigenous people like the Ainu that still live in Japan today. But in Japan, they will adopt some elements of Chinese culture through Korea. They'll borrow some of their writing. You will eventually get Buddhism that will come from the mainland to influence Japan. But by and large, they kind of blaze their own trail. So all the way up and, through World War II, the main form of faith that they had was Shintoism, which was a form of animism or nature worship, that they will blend in with some elements of Buddhism. And then by the 1800s, they start to incorporate the emperor into their belief systems as a god king, if you will. Now, Japan had an emperor for, a long time in their history, as far back as they can remember. But you also had a bunch of clans that would constantly fight with each other. And what happened is under the Yoritomo clan in 1147, the emperor, he would stay on the throne, but he was he lost a lot of his power to the head of the Yoritomo or the Yoritomo clan, which was known as a shogun. And what happened with the shogun is this is basically going to be like a general who will rule and direct things in Japan in the name of the emperor. But the clans continued to war with each other. So the samurai. So what you have is a shogun it's pictured in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen here, and then at the top left-hand corner, these are samurai. And so you're going to have samurai all the way up until the 1800s, 1900s. They're still around. In fact, a lot of the officers, a lot of the military leaders of World War II in Japan were descendants of the samurai. And what the samurai were highly trained warriors that basically were like mercenaries. They would go out and fight for different clans or different shoguns. So Japan, they have this very unique culture, and starting in 1600, they started seeing what was happening in China and Korea. They used to be pretty open, traded with other people, engaged with them. But when they started seeing, the Manchu, growing weaker to European traders, and they started seeing this happening in Korea, other parts of the world. What they decided to do was to close off all their borders to all Europeans, to all outsiders. And they remained this way up until 1853, when a U.S. Commodore, and a Commodore is a naval rank in our Navy. So a Commodore by the name of Matthew C. Perry, he went there and basically forced them open, threatened to basically open fire on Edo, their capital. And so trade started once again, and the Japanese were faced with a choice. They could either try to close their borders off again and see how that goes, or they could embrace this new world, and that's what they chose to do. And so they went through what was known as the Meiji Restoration. And what the Meiji Restoration was, on the one hand, and this is 1868, by the way, they started to, you had leaders in government that they wanted to restore the emperor back to his traditional throne as the supreme voice. They started to adopt Western forms of government, like having a parliament. But they also went out and they, very, very enthusiastically started to adopt Western technology and Western learning. And they industrialized very quickly. And so you had this rapid industrialization of their economy with entire industrial conglomerates controlled by their own people, known as the Zaibatsu. These were groups of companies to keep it out of European hands. And by the 1890s, they had been so successful that they actually went to war with Russia in the early 1900s. In the Russo-Japanese War and defeated this massive empire. So by the end of the Meiji Restoration, Japan was completely different, very modern, very technological, very industrial, and also growing increasingly militaristic. And so this would be also at the beginning of where we start seeing this course plotted of a military conflict between the two major Pacific powers of the late 1800s, early 1900s, which was Japan and the United States. So we have some very distinct, very unique cultures that are developing in early East Asia. The Japanese with their closed system that where they're inheriting a little bit from other places, but developing a lot of their own culture. Korea, stubbornly holding on to independence, at least up until the Manchu Dynasty. You have the Mongolians who blaze onto the scene with Genghis Khan and his grandson Kublai Khan. Of course, the diverse, massive empire of China with its ancient history as well, that gives this part of the world a very rich heritage.